Okay, so let's get back to this, because this is tough stuff right here. Remember, the permissive will is a function of the decretive will. Okay, so it's a circle within the larger circle, if you want to say. Okay, in order to grasp this, and this will help understand the nature of it, and the way to really talk about this is that this whole thing is God causing. Both are divine causation. However, there are two ways in which to cause a thing, and this is really true of us too. I used the light switch analogy last time, and unfortunately, a magician always should practice. I don't know what my failed, they turned the hallway light on instead of this, and I was like, oh, that's great, wonderful. So I'm not sure what that demonstrated, but humans do this all the time, but it's especially true of God, who creates ex nihilo. So think about that category of creating ex nihilo. These things have no existence until he speaks it into existence. Okay, so God causes all that he causes, which again is all things, in two ways. First, efficiently, and that belongs to the decree from the word efficient cause. Let's get the lees going here. And then secondly, well, it's already there, but permissively. Okay, well, how does that help me? Well, again, the light switch, but let me define these for you then, okay? Efficiently, in other words, by creating that which is not. So that's where ex nihilo creation comes in, which is everything, because nothing has the ability to exist except that God creates things. And by the way, this is not just, again, at the beginning as if he's over here. Genesis 1:1. And all the times it says, and God said, and God said. But it's also true, Colossians 1:17, that in him all things hold together. And Hebrews 1:3, he upholds the universe by the word of his power. So it's not here. If you want to picture think, it's here and everywhere. That God, by a singular decree, creates everything, all the stuff that things need to be. So that is efficient causality. He's creating that which is not. But then secondly, permissively, he withdraws some amount, lesser or greater degrees, he withdraws some operative grace. So if he's creating these things that were not, then over here or here or here, he lets go. And so we don't want to say the same imagery in both. But here he creates the thing. But then, like when you flip the light switch off, are you creating darkness? No. Does darkness have a substance, in other words? No. Okay, now if I flip the switch on, boom, the particles, these things arrange themselves, there's stuff. Now this is an analogy because we don't create ex nihilo like God does. But when we let it go, he could let it go completely. Job 34:15, that if he should set his heart to it and withdraw to himself his spirit and his breath, all things would return to dust. That's a Hebrew poetic, understated way to say it would cease to exist. If something is created ex nihilo from nothing, he lets it go. What does it have the power to do? Well, it goes back to its own nature. What's its own original nature? Nothing. Okay, so God can let go. So he causes all things either efficiently or permissively. He creates the whole nature of the thing here, but then as he lets it go according to its nature, not some magical way, not some parallel universe, not it initiating itself, but he lets it go according to its own nature, secondary causes falling out. Okay, so it's the secret to Pharaoh hardening his heart. God hardened Pharaoh. In Exodus, in those chapters, it says so many times that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and then it says a bunch of other times that Pharaoh hardened his heart. Which is it? It's both. At the same time, too. In two different relationships. Okay? So there's a lot there, a lot of things you can apply this to. But he does this permissively to some lesser degree or to some altered state. Even those in hell. He does not let them go to non-existence, but upholds them enough to pour out his wrath for eternity. The will of God is one. That is, it is simple, not composed of parts, not divisible. It's not one thing for God to will and another thing for God to be. Now, when you separate those, you're making what's called a logical distinction and not a real distinction between two extramental and separable entities. But you're making a logical distinction between two different senses in which God is. Okay? This raises questions both about God's freedom and God's triunity. How can it be one will, eternal, immutable, and so forth, so that whatever God wills is according to what God is, but if he wills this universe, but this universe didn't have to be, therefore, so you have that, and we will come to that. And then we haven't even really got to the, we've been applying this to the Trinity, but we haven't really got to that proper, so we have to wait for that too. But as to whether God wills all that he does of necessity, Thomas Aquinas answers, he gives us an early answer. He says, quote, there are two ways in which a thing is said to be necessary, namely absolutely and by supposition. Now you could say, and we used these words earlier, the absolute versus the consequent, but the Socinians used it wrong. They used it about his will reacting. But it's a real thing, not with respect to will per se, but with respect to separable wills, but with respect to necessity. Something could be necessary, absolute necessity, let's do that. Absolute necessity versus, and this I'm going to point back here, and I'll show you why. We're going to call it consequent necessity. Thomas is going to say of absolute necessity or of supposition. What does he mean by that? Well, he means, well, I'll read it first. I don't want to steal his thunder. So, for instance, it is necessary that God orders all things according to his goodness. So whatever God does, he must be good. Yet it is not necessary that God creates a man. Yet, supposing, so he means by supposition, supposing he creates a man, he will order all things in human nature, whether original creation, whether in redemption, or in restoration, he will order it in such a way as it conforms, as the arrow, conforms to his goodness. So he must do this. He must. Only things in himself. Absolutely. However, if he's going to save us, which he did not have to, he cannot do it in a way that contradicts his character. So is the cross necessary? Yes and no. It's not necessary to his being, because he didn't have to create us to begin with. But it is necessary for him to save us in a way that does not contradict his character. Now there I'm even broad brushing, because there's a debate, and Irenaeus and others talked about this. Couldn't God have saved in a different way? By fiat do this versus that? We're not going that deep. Okay? We're just going to draw this out. What it means for something to be necessary in God's will. So both are necessary, but the former has an absolute necessity and the latter a consequent necessity. And we will keep bringing back that concept. Let's ask the question, does God have libertarian free will? We talked about what libertarian free will was last time, so if I repeat myself in defining it again, you know, it is what it is. But libertarian free will. I guess God creating, we could do this way or this way, but let's do A versus non-A. It could be A, B, and a C. Various choices. But let's just say there's two choices, and is God free to choose this one or that one? Is God free to do that? In other words, is he free to do what he did uncaused by anything other than himself? Problem is that's cheating, because we would want to affirm that. But that's not what libertarian free will really means. Libertarian free will means something a bit more specific. It means, to review last time, it means the ability to do or do otherwise. Okay, I'm tracking with him so far. Specifically, without any necessity of nature causing one choice versus the other. Okay? So there's There's a way to reason this out in terms of classical theology. But the terms have way too much baggage. I mean, if you go back to Turretin, for example, they'll use the language of the liberty of indifference. So God has the liberty of indifference. He's free to do this or that in such a way that this is not compelling him. That this is not a necessity in God. Well, this is not a necessity in God, this thing outside of God. Okay, so if that's what you mean, that's fine. So we're making these distinctions. But we never mean that this is a freedom that is pit against the necessity of his whole essence. Whatever God does is always according to all that is in God. Okay? We go back to Thomas's distinction between the absolutely necessary, and the consequent necessity. What we find is that even of those things that did not have to be, because God was under no necessity, but freely willed those things, even of those, that which is willed is only willed according to all that God is. So that God is both free to do this or to do that, but never free, and I'm going to use that in quotes, never free to do contrary to all that is in God. Because that would not be a freedom, but a contradiction. That would be a deprivation in his being, which is impossible. And that brings up the last, I don't know if it's the last tough thing, but the last new grammar for you, if you're not familiar with this. And I want to try to get this on the board that's already there so I can connect it to other ideas. There is the debate in the late Middle Ages between realism, this one not between realism and nominalism, but between realism and voluntarism. Because realism was the doctrine that everything down here, these particulars, the words we use, the way things are according to what the philosophers would call universals, what we would call them the attributes of God and the ideas in the mind of God, that those things like justice and goodness and oneness are actually real, eternal essence in God. The nominalists said, nope, those words are just names that we conveniently slap on things, and so on and so forth. How's realism against voluntary? And voluntarism, I don't mean a community project that we all get involved in, but the word does come from the word for volition, will. And so the issue here is, why did God create the kind of world that we have? What is it about this world? Was he free to do it? So voluntarism, let's put voluntarism in here, meaning God is completely, I'm going to put it in quotes because I don't agree with this definition of freedom. He's free, and instead of an arrow, I'm going to put a stop right there. Free without respect to his nature. So what's the driving force to creation? Will. God's will. We believe in God's sovereignty. So a lot of new Calvinists messed this up too. A lot of new Calvinists became voluntarists against those that knew about this at all. But essentially that's what's happening, is voluntarism. Whereas realism would say that no, everything is the way it is because of something real in God. But we would say that's not apart from will. That's not free. Okay? And so that gets into the questions even of natural law versus positive law. It gets into all these different... So this is actually a huge debate that unlocks all these other debates. Okay? So Bavinck says it like this. He talks about the free will of God versus the necessary will of God. Bavinck says this. He says, God's will in relation to himself is his propensity toward himself as a goal. His will with respect to his creatures is his propensity toward creatures as a means. Now we're cheating again, because this gets into the glory of God and Jonathan Edwards' book, The End for Which God Created the World. What's the driving force to everything? Well, you'd say, well, it's the first cause, God. Yes, and in the first cause, you have the end cause. The first cause and the end cause belong to ultimate cause. Okay, so the end for which God created the world, he causes all things for his glory. He does everything he does, and he can only do all that he does because of something in himself, not because of something outside of himself, which doesn't exist yet, because he didn't create anything. Okay, using yet again in quotes, okay? Remember from the last couple of times. Okay, so God is creating all that he's creating based on something in himself. Okay, so we get into a lot of things there, which I'm going to have to skip. Well, here's one. So a lot of people, their criticism of realism and God creating everything based on the idea of natural law, that would mean that God wasn't free to create those things. You know, things are just the way they are because God is sovereign and he just does things. Okay, he does things according to, well, you don't want to shackle God and make him have to do something because of some extraneous, stop, it's not extraneous, it's in him. So they have in their mind, by realism, Plato's idea of what was called the demiurgos, the demiurge God. In one of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus, was his creation myth, where when they hear the forms, justice, oneness, and so on, Plato's God looked out at this blueprint of the archetypes, the forms, and on the basis of those created the world, which were shadows of the archetypes, which were outside of him. We're not saying that the forms are outside of God in some blueprint. We're saying that these, and Augustine corrected Plato, that these are actually ideas in the mind of God, which reduce then to all that is in God. And the Bible teaches that. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, skies above proclaim his handiwork. And so in all the things that are created, they are all icons or images of God, speaking something about God. Okay? So God created everything freely to talk about himself. But himself is a nature. Himself is a nature. So God has a nature. Meaning only that God is what he is and not something else. His essence. Okay? But in their minds, the voluntarist, their concept of will, God has to be sovereign and free. What do I mean by that? Well, when he freely makes things, there's no other reason. It's his reason. Okay? No other reason or cause prior to the will. We wouldn't say it's prior, but they would say it has to be apart from. Will has to be primal. The reasoning is this. If all created things are contingent, they're not necessary, God didn't have to make them, then the cause of God's will must be, old philosophical word, must be accidental, not essential to him. The will, this is Bavinck again, the will accordingly is the cause of all reality. And Bavinck correctly identifies this or compares it to the Muslim view of Allah. One of the reasons Islam doesn't do theology so much as it does legal commentary on the Quran or the Hadith or whatever is because in Islamic theology, the school that won early out was, and it became anti-intellectual because it focused on the will of Allah. It was impious to ask what God, it's meaningless to ask what Allah is like. You just do what he says. And in fact, that's how Allah created everything. He just did what he did. And so Bavinck correctly identifies this late medieval departure from realism in philosophers that don't matter, especially William of Ockham. But before the Reformation, these guys that went in a voluntarist direction, he correctly links that to the Muslim view, where in Islam, there's consequences of this. Allah continues to create all things in such a way that no subsequent choice needs to have any connection to anything that came prior. This controls the Muslim doctrine of revelation, their doctrine of abrogation. And it's why the Quran, subsequent revelation can supersede revelation that came before it. And you say, I'm getting into Islam here, but don't you Christians have the same idea in progressive revelation? No, this does not make that nothing. This is a flowering of what was already there in DNA form. Okay, whereas in Islam, Allah can utterly contradict himself. We would call it a contradiction. They would just call it none of your business or I'll chop off your head. That's what they would call it. But that's consistent with the idea of voluntarism. Okay, and so in this concept of voluntarism, will is all and nature is nil. And so there's this battle between this concept of the freedom of God versus natural law, versus realism, really, versus the life of the mind and theology. Okay, fast forward. Some objections. Try to get through these. Two simple objections that were met by Aquinas, both of which might look way too simple at first, but it opens up discussions on concepts like pure actuality, which we didn't have a separate week for, and maybe we should. And then the possible ends for God's decrees, which we will talk about more with his glory. So these are simple, but they might get you thinking about those. And this is word for word from the Summa Theologica. Objection 1. It seems that God does not will things apart from himself. For the divine will is the divine existence. So stop right here. The person objecting is not a blockhead that believes that nothing exists outside of God. He's trying to push a dilemma back on the classical position and say, look, Thomas, if I take that position, that God only wills according to all that he is, here's what ensues. So he says, it seems that God does not will things apart from himself. For the divine will, as you say, is the divine existence. But God is not other than himself. Therefore, he does not will things other than himself. It's sort of a pantheistic idea. Somebody could hear this to say, well, God's will is God. But you just said God willed all things that happened. Therefore, yeah, it's something like that. So Aquinas says, quote, the divine will is God's own existence essentially, yet they differ in aspects. You remember I talked about the difference between a logical distinction and a real distinction. A logical distinction is really two or more ways to look at or things about a thing. So it's purely mentally aspects of a thing versus separable entities, real distinction between things, plural. Okay? So Aquinas is saying the will is God's own existence essentially, but they differ in aspect according to the different ways of understanding them and expressing them. For when we say that God exists, no relation to any other object is implied, as we do imply when we say that God wills. Therefore, although he is not anything apart from himself, yet he does will things apart from himself. So Aquinas is basically saying, if I say God exists, you understand that to refer only to God. If I say God wills, you understand that there's a direct object that's implied, that I'm speaking about things outside of himself. Aquinas wasn't allowed to end any of his objections or his responses by saying, you knucklehead. But some of them, I think, it's implied. Objection 2, further, the will, this is a little bit harder, the willed moved the willer. Okay, so I have an end. I'm hungry. I see cheeseburger. That's cheeseburger, just trust me. Okay? This moved me. Pathetically enough. But this moved me. The end moved me. Okay? And so the willed moves the willer. You see where this is going? And he quotes Aristotle. As stated in De Anima, that's Latin for the soul. And so he quotes Aristotle. He's basically saying, Thomas, you like Aristotle so much? Aristotle said that if you will something, that end moves, sets you in motion. If, therefore, God wills anything apart from himself, his will must be moved by another, which is impossible. He responds, quote, in things willed for the sake of the end, the whole reason for our being moved is the end, and this it is that moves the will, as most clearly appears in things that willed for the sake of the end. He uses the example of medicine. He uses an old-fashioned word for it. And he basically says, when you take medicine, you're not really, ooh, medicine, yummy. No, health is your greater end. So there's a subordinate end to this greater end. And you could say, well, Thomas, that doesn't answer my objection. You're still being moved just by this. Right. Now pretend you're God. Okay? Is what he's saying is that this end is himself. And so all these then are means, therefore they are subordinate ends to achieve this ultimate end. And that goes into Bavinck, what he said before, God's inclination toward himself as his will, but to the creature as a means. God is driven toward the creature as a means toward himself. Okay, so I had to simplify Aquinas there. Objection 3. If all that comes to pass is by invincible decree, now we're departing from Thomas here. If all that comes to pass is by invincible decree, then God willed evil as well as the good. Therefore, God is the author of evil. So we got into that whole, that's why we talked about efficient causation versus permissive. So we will construct a full answer to that using those terms when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about goodness and things like that. But just to throw some more bricks on that and be able to get some more grammar, let's add this. And we're going to add something concerning the divine will per se. Bavinck says it like this. He says, quote, "But though God wills all creatures as means for his own, creatures as means and for his own sake, he wills some of those creatures more than others, to the degree that they are more direct and suitable means for his glorification." Now he offers a useful analogy. Bavinck uses the analogy of a father wielding a knife, yet forbidding that same knife to his son, explaining how God can will sin differently than he abhors it, differently than he forbids it. So God, the Father, wills the knife, but he forbids that same knife from his son, at least at that stage of development. Okay, so which is it? Does he will the knife or not the knife? In different respects. And you can see that with the father and the son with a knife. Okay, and so finally on this point, God's revealed will and secret will are not opposed here, as if the latter hates sin and the former approves sin. In fact, the revealed realizes the hidden will and brings it to fruition. So we start to see eventually, the disciples had this problem. They saw the cross, and for the cross, if you told them, well, God willed that in one way, but not another. Okay, so his hidden will, if they suppose they had this deep conversation and analyzed it, well, they would have seen after the resurrection how the revealed will started to realize that higher sense in the hidden will. So sometimes that's happening as well. There's other objections here about the will of God being immutable and so forth. I suppose we've done a good job of that when we talked about immutability. Turretin deals with something that kind of borders on last week as well. He says unfilled promises and threatenings don't argue. Sorry, this is a response to the objection that I didn't read. Basically, all those passages that we kind of hinted at last week, we talked about anthropomorphisms. We looked at 3 examples from Genesis to show that this is not God learning. This is happening for this reason. You might have thought, and somebody watching might have thought, well, that was easy. You should have brought out the repentance in Nineveh and 1 Samuel 23 and Hezekiah and the son and the healing and what's the other one? And in the language in Jeremiah 18 elsewhere, that if this city does that and they repent, then I will do this. But if they don't do this, then I will do this. Turretin says, unfulfilled promises and threatenings do not argue a change of will because they were conditional and not absolute. So when man disobeys a condition set forth by God, what would naturally follow the condition goes undone. But the decree was not overthrown. Well, I don't have the prescriptive out there anymore. But the prescriptive will, man responds to that badly. And it's too much writing on this board. Okay? Blessing for this, cursing for this. Book over here talking about the prescriptive will. This guy, God's saying, if you do that, you will get a blessing. If you don't do it, check an X. You'll get a curse. Okay, so if he does this and the curse comes, the decree wasn't altered. This condition versus that condition was all altered. But as it turns out, God decreed the other and not the former. And you can reverse that if the guy repents. The decree is not what changed. The shown condition and its consequent is what changed. Okay, there's a lot of other ways to say that if we slowed down, but we can't slow down. Okay? But I think Turretin's answer, and he goes on to answer it more. I got 2 minutes. If the will of God is timeless and immutable, then this will is impersonal, since purpose is required and so forth. I would just say this objection is question-begging. I have a quote from Paul Helm that pushes back against this, and I think it's good. But I would just say that's question-begging. Helm says it this way. He says, it does not follow from the claim that an eternal being does not purposefully initiate actions that such a being does not have purposes. He may have timeless purposes, purposes which are brought about in time, that is, in the temporal order of his creation. So what the objector is saying is that, look, I know persons, and persons have purposes, and I know purposes, that takes deliberation. Stop. You're begging the question. The whole question is whether or not God can have timeless purposes, and you haven't done anything to refute that by saying, I know a bunch of people down here that... Stop. We're not talking about a bunch of people down here. Okay, so that's all your objection amounted to. Two practical uses of this doctrine. First of all, to know this doctrine is to know that every personal detail of life is intended by God in the ways that we've been talking about. And secondly, it is to know that the gospel will of God is simple and immutable. So this doctrine is given to know that every personal detail of life is intended by God. Psalm 139, even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. And we started with Ephesians 1. That's your homework assignment. Read Ephesians 1, 3 through 14, and you'll see how this is gospel as well. So we'll end there, and we'll talk about God's wisdom and power next time. His wisdom and power.